I do want to welcome all of you this afternoon to our service, and it is good to be in the house of the Lord, and a very special welcome to our friends watching us online. You probably noticed an interesting trend that Angela always gets assigned the long and complicated passages. One never knows how these things work out, Pastor Roger, but yes, we just leave it there. The next time we have a long and complicated passage, you can be sure that Angela will be assigned to read that. So today we end our After Easter series. And next Sunday, as you know, is Mother's Sunday. And we have two dedications, as Pastor Roger shared with me. And the Sunday after that is Ascension Sunday. And the Sunday after that is Pentecost Sunday. So shall we say we have a full church calendar and lots of good things to look forward to as the Lord works in and through us. Now, as we've been looking at the After Easter series, we have been reflecting on that passage, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 to 7. And we have been looking at some wonderful principles and insights from God's word. As the Apostle Peter has been writing to the church, to the believers scattered, he's been telling them that you need to hold fast to your faith. And we have been learning as we reflected on that passage, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 all the way to 7, that we are people of a living hope. We have an inheritance, a glorious inheritance of eternal dimensions and significance. And then the Apostle Peter also reminded us, but while we have this living hope which we are born again into, we have this wonderful inheritance, we also have trials. And last Sunday we talked about the place of trials. And we talked about the fact that trials are tests. And we talked about the refiner's fire. Now today, as we conclude this series on the After Easter, as we conclude the After Easter series, I want to look at the life of a person who was really in love with God. He wanted to please God. He wanted to do what God wanted him to do. His heart yearned for God. His heart longed for God, just like a deer pants for water. And that's the person we read about in Psalm 42, verses 1 through 11. It's a follower of God who is in love with God. He's genuine, wants to seek God's will, and just longs for God. But for whatever reason, this person in this psalm is going through a storm. He's going through a rough patch in life. And in verse 3, he says, my tears are my food. In other words, he's saying, day and night, I can feel my tears. I am crying. I'm just going through all these trials, all these storms. And to add insult to injury, there are people around him who are saying, we'll be praying for you. We'll be encouraging you. No, they're not doing that. But on the contrary, what's the question they are asking in verse 3? There are people around him who are asking him, where is your God? In other words, they are scoffing, they are taunting him and saying, you talk about this God, that he is alive, he is the resurrected King of Kings, and he is the God of all glory, and you are attending all the church activities and getting involved in the life of the church and the community, but where is your God when you are going through the storm? So while this man is in love with God, he seeks to walk in obedience with God, he is going through a very difficult season in his life. And to add to that, he has people scoffing at him. And this is making him very, very miserable. He's coming before God in this psalm, and he is saying, God, I'm going through a storm, and these people are making my life even more sad and more complicated. And so from this psalm, there are just two tips that I drew so that we can learn how to go through the storm with hope, riding through the storm with hope. Because we all know that we have been through storms. Some of us have been through storms. Some of us are going through storms. Some of us recall how painful and how difficult those times were. When we go through storms, the first question we always ask is what? Well, you're all spiritual people. You don't question God. But if you're, as I'd like to say, lesser mortals like us, you will say, God, why? And sometimes we make that question even better. We said, God, why me or why us? And some of us, not Church of God people, but people from the other churches, have an even better question. They say, God, how come so-and-so is not going through the storm? Why is it only me? And so if we are human, anytime we go through a storm, we ask that question. We may not ask people, but we ask ourselves, God, why me? And one of the things that we have picked up during our series through the last 3 or 4 weeks is that storms make us stronger in our faith. Now you might say, Pastor Ben, that's easily said than done. And I do agree with you. It is only the person who goes through the storm who understands the full pain and the full intensity of that experience. But anytime we go through a storm, that's when we draw closer to God. If you think about it, when was the last time any one of us prayed for a long time about a challenge or about any need? It was when it was beyond us, when that challenge was above and beyond us, when it was overwhelming. That's when we spend time in prayer. It is often these challenges and storms that bring us closer to God, draw us deeper into very intimate experiences with God. And so if we care to think about it and reflect on it, hard as it might be to accept, storms do bring us closer to God. They make us stronger in our faith. They take us deeper into our relationship with God. Between 1987 and 1991, there were some scientists who came up with a project called the Biosphere 2. So if you Google up Biosphere 2, you will discover that it was an experiment they started between 1987 and 1991. It is located in a place called, it's in the state of Arizona. It's in a place called Oracle. And it's a large project, and it's a self-contained community. It's what they call a closed ecological system. And what these scientists were trying to do was to set up a mini Earth in this large location. And they were exploring possibilities of checking out if human beings or human communities could live in outer space. So they experimented by creating this Biosphere 2, as they called it. It was a closed system. It had everything you needed. They had waves, they had beaches, they had lakes, they had waterfalls, they had animals, they had creatures, they have all kinds of things, plants, trees, you name it. It was all closed. They had day, they had night, they had everything set up. Of course, for a variety of reasons, the project initially folded up. It was not viable. But one of the things they discovered when it came to trees was that the trees within the Biosphere 2 were always bent and somewhat droopy. And later they discovered that that's because these trees were not exposed to the winds of adversity. Because trees out in the open were exposed to strong winds, exposed to winds of adversity. And as a result of that, the trees became stronger. They became more resistant to the winds of adversity. And so as I thought about that, I realized that even when we go through the storms as children of God, we become stronger in our faith, and God becomes more real, and God becomes more closer to us. So I suppose one way to look at it, as one preacher said, is don't just go through the storm, but try to grow through the storm. And if you look at it that way, it makes a world of difference. Not simply going through the storm, but growing through the storm. So as we look at Psalm 42, from the life of this person, I want to share 2 tips that will enable us to hold our hope in the storm. Now, we don't know who wrote this psalm. The inscription at the top says that this was written by the sons of Korah. They put it together. Some scholars believe this was the experiences of King David put together. But you will notice at the top it says this is a maskil. Maskil in Hebrew probably means this is a psalm of deep reflection. So as you read this psalm, you will discover it is not a psalm that is full of high praise. It is not a psalm that is full of worship and adoration of our God. It is instructive. It is stirring you up to ponder and to reflect and to go deep. And so as we go through these 11 verses, I just want to share 2 tips or 2 insights that will help us hold our hope in the storm. The first one is remembering rightly. Now, we all remember things, don't we? Of course, I forget, as Marlies will testify today. I promised to give her the slot to make the announcement, and then I forgot. We all have our moments like that. We all remember very well, of course. But in this psalm, you will see that the writer talks about remembering rightly. And in verse 4, he says, people have been scoffing and taunting me and asking me, where is your God? And when they do that, instead of being influenced by all that they are saying, I remember the good experiences with God. He says, I remember in verse 4 how I would lift my voice and praise and worship God. And he says, I remember Jordan. I remember all these mountains that I've been through. So when people are taunting, when people are trying to bring him down, what does he remember? He remembers the goodness of God. And I call that remembering rightly. Now, when we go through the storms of life, there are things that people say. There are things that happen to us that can bring us down even further. And the first thing to remember is we ought to remember rightly. It is not what we remember, but how we choose to remember. Things happen to us, but those who succeed are the people who learn to remember rightly. How is the psalmist remembering these experiences? He is remembering these experiences from the perspective of God's goodness, not based on the circumstances. The second tip that I want to share is we see in verse 5 and verse 11, he's saying, why are you discouraged, O my soul? Why are you disheartened, O my soul? So you see it up there. If you can see it, pull out your magnifying glasses. It might help a little bit. But you will see in verse 5 and verse 11, the same expression is repeated. Why are you so discouraged? Why are you so downcast, O my soul? And I call this challenging our thinking. This is the psalmist talking to whom? Talking to himself. So the storms and the trials and the challenges that he's going through are causing him to entertain all kinds of thoughts. But he's challenging those thoughts. And even in our lives, when we go through storms, it is human to have all kinds of thoughts. Why is this happening to me? Why is this taking place in my life, in the life of my family? How come this is going on for such a long time? Why isn't there a breakthrough? And that's when the psalmist says, or the psalmist is engaging in a discipline that we call challenging our thinking, which is like, how come you're thinking about these things? Talking to yourself, saying, why are you so negative? How can you think like this after all that God has done? How come you're just letting yourself go down on this slippery slope when you have forgotten all the good things that God had done in the past? In fact, the first thing that I talked about is that he remembered rightly. And what was he remembering? He looked back and he drew from all the wonderful things that God has done. And that's another helpful thing that we can remember as we go through the storm. If we are going through the storm now, we look back and we recognize, we remember all the wonderful things God has done, how He came through for us in the past, the miraculous interventions of God, His sustaining grace, His compassion, how He saw us through time and time again. And He has brought us to this point thus far. And the second thing that I was just talking about is challenging our thinking, where He's asking Himself, why are you letting yourself down like this? And what does He say? He says, hope in God. He's saying, don't go down that slippery slope. You need to stop and start hoping God. And He's talking to Himself. And I do want to talk about challenging our thinking by looking at 1 Samuel chapter 27. That's our next slide. And David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. Now, what do we see here? David is on the run. And David is thinking to himself, despite all the assurances that he has received, despite all the assurances that he has received from God, through his good friend Jonathan, what does he say to himself? One of these days, it's going to finish. I'm going to die. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what are you saying to yourself today? What are you thinking about yourself, about your circumstances, and what are you saying to yourself? Are you saying, it's finished, nothing's going to work, nobody's going to help me, the breakthrough will never come? Or are you saying, hope in the Lord because He will come through for you? And that's really tied into what I want to share. In verse 5 and verse 11, the writer of this psalm says, why are you downcast, O my soul? He's challenging his own thinking. And then he says, hope in the Lord. This word hope is a very interesting word. This word hope that is used in this psalm is a word in Hebrew that is used over 40 times. And it is a word that is pronounced as yakal. Now, we don't want to go into the semantics and the details, but it is a word that is used over 40 times whenever they talk about hope. Now, I am going to give you a simple exercise. I'm going to take you to a word or a verse, and I'm going to ask you, where do you find the word hope in this verse? It's the same word. So let's go to the next slide, which is Genesis chapter 8, verse 12. And you remember the story of Noah. And God told Noah, I am going to send you and your family, build this ark and you will be safe. And you know all about that. And you know the raven and the doves and all of that story. In verse 12, we see Noah waited 7 more days and then sent the dove out again. But this time it did not return to him. Do you see the word hope anywhere there? H-O-P-E? No, you don't. You can try any English version. You will never find the word hope there. What do you think the word hope is there? Wait. And that's the word yakal. It's used over 40 times. And in the Hebrew Old Testament, it is used anytime they refer to wait. And hope has to do with waiting. Now, hope to the Hebrew mind was an intertwining, or was a merging, or was the coming together of 2 important elements. The first one was waiting. There was no running away from waiting, because if you hoped, you had to wait. The second strand, the most important strand, was a lot depended on whom you were waiting for. The character and the personality of the person you were waiting for. So 2 important strands. Number 1 is it has to do with waiting. Number 2, the person you are waiting for. The person, the integrity of the person who will come through for you. So if you take the life of Noah, the story of Noah, Noah waited for 7 days. But his waiting was based on Genesis 6, Genesis 7, because he knew that God would come through for him. God said the floods will recede and you and your sons will go out. So Noah sent the birds, they came back, and he waited. And so I just want to leave us with that note to say that anytime we go through a storm, there is the waiting. But we wait knowing that the one we are waiting for is reliable. He will come through at the right time, not too early, not too late. He will come through with his plan and purpose. And that is the God whom we serve. May God bless the reflection of his word.